Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm Rebecca Friedman, and I'm the director of the Wolfsonian Public Humanities Lab at Florida International University. Welcome back today to season 2 of the Public Humanities Lab's Coffee and Conversations, Museums and Histories of Anti-Blackness. As many of you know, we first began this webinar at the start of the coronavirus pandemic and quarantine, now a lifetime ago, in order to understand how cultural institutions were handling the changes before us at that time. The pandemic, however, is not isolated, as we know. Rather, as we continue to see the need to end anti-Black violence, we acknowledge the overlapping pandemics of today, deeply rooted in the past. So today in our conversation, we will continue to emphasize the significance of centering Black lives and experiences in museums and cultural institutions, and the challenges of working against the powers at those institutions and the field of public history or society more generally, that have historically sought to erase, marginalize, or whitewash Black histories and experiences. The responsibility and power of cultural institutions has never been more poignant than it is today. And we are lucky enough to have an excellent guest with us today. We have Brad Massey, who is the Saunders Foundation Curator of Public History at the Tampa Bay History Center. He recently completed a book tentatively titled State of Change, A Technological and Social History of Florida, which is under contract with the University of Florida Press. So we have with us an expert. Very briefly, thank you, Brad, for being here today. Welcome. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Just very briefly, our format is simple. The two of us will talk for about 20 minutes, and then we will take questions from the audience for the remaining 10 minutes. So at any time, you can submit a question using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. So welcome. So Brad, let's just start with a kind of broad question to help us understand what it is that you do. If you can just briefly describe for us the work that you do at the Tampa Bay History Center.
Yeah, no problem. So as you said, I'm the Saunders Foundation Curator of Public History, which is a fancy way to say that I do a lot of writing for the History Center. So I write the exhibits ranging from, we currently have a history of professional wrestling here in Florida. I'm also writing an exhibit tentatively titled Cuban Pathways. That's going to be about the migration of people to and from Cuba over the last 500 years. So I write a lot for the History Center. As you said, I just completed a book project. And then I also give a lot of public talks. So today's presentation is right in my wheelhouse. I go out to local civic groups and talk. I just did Professional Development Day for the Pinellas County school teachers. So as the Curator of Public History, write the exhibits and also do things out in the public forum.
That's great. So really the work you do could not possibly be more important than it is today.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
It's true. Can you tell us a little bit, I know you're back, you're in your office now.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about what that process was like, the decision to go back to work in person and how kind of your job and your work now has been impacted by the pandemic?
Yeah, so for me, I never completely went away. You know, kind of like a family member you don't want to see anymore. You know, I just can't, I never completely disappeared. So what happened was, of course, in March, you know, COVID happens and then the museum closes, Tampa Bay History Center closes. But what we really wanted to do was still have an outreach beyond the walls of the History Center. So just a few of us, and I was one of them, came to the History Center and we worked on a project called the Museum from Home. And what we tried to do is we tried to offer our audience experiences outside of the walls of the History Center, which they couldn't obviously visit. So we did videos. We did a segment called the History Center from 6 feet away, where my colleague Rodney Kite Powell and I, we sat on different sides of a table. This was, you know, before they were telling us all to wear masks. We were just social distancing, and then, you know, when things started to change with COVID, we stopped doing that, and I started doing more just short, like documentary videos, 3 or 4 minutes. So basically, I went from, you know, a full-time schedule to a more irregular in-person schedule. And then the Tampa Bay History Center opened to guests, I think it was June 1st. with timed tickets. So from March to June, it was a regular, and then since June, it's been a more regular schedule for us here.
Got it. Would you say, I'm going off script here, but would you say that the content of what it is that you did or what you were responsible for changed in those months when you were remote?
Yeah, I think it did change. I think one of the good things was we tried to get into the collection. And so, for example, I did a short film on the orange industry. So I literally rummaged through the collection. I'm like, well, what can I find that'll tell the story of oranges, and why have I selected this topic? And then we found a grove heater. And then the idea was, speaking to sort of today's topics, there's a lot of people involved in orange cultivation. How do I tell the stories of all the people? How do I tell a complete story? And of course, that can be very challenging, even when you have things like a grove heater and other things in the collection. So yeah, I think it changed what we did in that, we always do object engagement, but the idea was, well, what objects can we find that we can tell good stories remotely that people aren't going to physically encounter?
Right. And so the stories that you tell, would you say, are primarily focused on the immediate community? Or,
yeah, the immediate community for us being the Tampa Bay area.
Okay.
So, we like to say that we represent the history of the Bay Area. Historically, we've definitely been skewed towards Tampa proper.
Okay.
But part of the History Center's outreach is to tell a broader part of Florida history. And that's one of the reasons I was working on the book that you had mentioned. So, yeah, I guess if I have full disclosure, we do focus on Tampa, but the goal is to try to be more inclusive of the broader area.
Sure. So given that, what would you say about, what would you say that the museum field in general, and that the Tampa Bay History Center in particular, whether or not museums and cultural institutions and your institution have been proactive or reactive when it comes to questions of racism and social justice that are so very important today? In other words, would you suggest that this is something the field is only taking seriously now, because there's so much talk, of course, among museum professionals about issues of social justice and racism in ways that I think are in the forefront more than they've been in the past, from what I've seen, but I guess I'm turning to you as expert. Is that your experience? In other words, do you feel like there's a kind of proactive, long-standing impulse in that direction, or it's something that we're reacting to events of today?
Yeah, I think the honest answer is historically we have not been proactive, not near as we should have been. At times we were just full on unactive and non-active. And then at other times we were reactive. So for example, and just to give everyone a little context, I've been at the History Center for about 1.5 years. So my eyes are still pretty fresh about the institution. And I came from the college and university experience. And I was told, well, one thing that they tried to do here at the History Center, and we've tried to do, is, kind of incorporate African-American history into our different levels on the museum. But a lot of the visitors have argued, well, you didn't do it, right? When they walk through, they don't see the Black experience. They don't see African-American history. And then as I rummaged through the collection, especially during COVID, and I talked to my colleagues, one of the things they said to me is that, well, we've had trouble collecting from the African-American community. We'd like to do better. And so I said, okay, well, what are the collection initiatives? And that's where I was kind of like, well, there's not a clear collection initiative.
I see.
So I think historically, truth be told, a little reactive and unactive, but in recent events, we've become, more active. And I think one of the things that we've realized is we've been honest as an institution, and then this has been a blind spot, right? We haven't collected actively. And a lot of that has to do with the composition of the board, which is changing for the better. Diversity isn't the be all and end all, but it matters, right? And now that, the makeup of our board is starting to change, we're hoping in our collections department that we are going to be more proactive. And I can tell you about some of the initiatives we have a little bit later.
Sure. Thank you. Can you give the audience the context of the community itself in the Tampa Bay area when it comes to, not to the issues of race and ethnicity and all of that, in case they don't know?
Yeah, so Tampa, it's a really diverse place. I'm actually giving a talk for a local healthcare group for Hispanic Heritage Month. And so I was crunching some stats yesterday. And 27% of Hillsborough County, which is Tampa's in Hillsborough County, is Hispanic, right? We also have a large African American population. So when people think about Tampa, a lot of times they think about the cigar industry, they think about Cuban immigration, and then they just kind of forget, you know, Tampa history in some ways, I think, kind of just falls off the cliff for people outside the community. But for us, you know, this is a very diverse place. And, you know, now we have a lot of Asian immigrants, particularly from South Asia. There's a large Indian community here in Tampa. So Tampa continues, you know, from the early modern period when, you know, there was only 720 people in, you know, roughly 1880. All of a sudden you have this population explosion. And that diversity and that movement of immigrants to and from Tampa has continued up until this period. And that's one thing we want to do here at the History Center is we want to tell, you know, all these different stories.
That's wonderful. And does your collection allow for that, or would that mean reaching out to other partner institutions?
No, it does not allow for that. I mean, we have stuff, we have some good stuff, but we need to reach out. So for example, the exhibit I'm working on, Cuban Pathways, we've reached out to the Smithsonian, we've reached out to the University of Florida, the Museum of Florida History. I've talked to some of your colleagues, you know, asking them to please let us borrow things. So yeah, I mean, there's definitely holes in the collection. And when it comes to putting together exhibits, it just proves that, you know, we need to work on developing the collection, and we need to work with partner institutions to put on the best exhibits that we can.
No, absolutely. And it seems that the collaboration piece has never been more important. So I think a lot of institutions are looking to collaborate and work with one another. So you've kind of begun to answer the next question, but let's see if I can press you just a bit. What do you see as some of the core issues shaping the conversation around racism and social justice at the Tampa Bay History Center and other museums in Florida and beyond? So if you could just talk about not only the ideas for exhibitions and conversations where you are, but also if you could talk a little bit about Florida more generally or beyond, if that's something you'd like to do as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the core mission is at this point, we need to collect. I think we've been negligent, right, when it comes to collecting for the African American community. And I think the quicker we try to remedy that, the better. So for example, you know, with COVID and of course the Black Lives Matter movement, as I was telling you, we were trying to put on these videos to tell these stories. And as I rummaged through the collection, we don't have a lot of things. And so one of the questions we then had is, well, how do we react to this? Like, how do we tell the community? Obviously, we're acknowledging that these are incredibly important historical times. And one of the ideas was, well, why don't we just do a civil rights video, you know, and talk about the few things that we have. I went home that night, I was asked to write it. And I came to work the next morning and I said, well, that's a cop-out, right? I mean, don't get me wrong, the antecedents of the Black Lives Matter movement are in the civil rights era, but we're not solving a problem. We're not collecting, you know. So a group of my colleagues and I got together and we said, you know, this is a moment to go out and actually collect, right? We've been talking about how we haven't done these things because we've been unactive, we've been reactive, but let's go meet people where they are. So like a lot of institutions, you know, we sent out a statement. We said, we want to hear your stories. We want to collect. So we created this thing called Tampa Bay Stories. And then a small cohort of us went out into the community. We went to the protest and we collected. And as one of the curators who's worked here for decades said, he goes, you know, through this initiative itself, we probably quadrupled or more our collection of African-American materials. So I think, you know, it's easy to be critical of the institution in the past. I think that's fair. I think those criticisms are needed. But I think we need to take those criticisms, look at those blind spots that you're talking about because they exist, and then we need to go forward and collect. And then the last thing I'll say is another thing we're really excited about here is we're going to be involved in the opening of an African-American history museum here in Tampa at a former African-American boarding house called the Jackson House. And so one of our, you know, we're really interested in it, but then the question is, well, what are we going to put in it? I mean, we haven't collected. So now we are collecting. We're reaching out to the community to tell them about the initiative. And, you know, we're trying to do the best we can. So that was a really long answer. I think the short answer is I think it's critical that we collect. right?
Yeah.
The African American community is incredibly important. Its history is long, it's robust. Our collection doesn't reflect that, and we need to try to fix that as best we can.
I mean, it's a really interesting set of issues for all kinds of reasons. So, you know, to kind of look inside and to think about ways in which you as an institution, you and your colleagues as an institution, can begin to understand better, more broadly, the African American community around you. And simultaneous to that, if there is an African American History Museum or Jackson House, I think you said, that is opening now, then the question becomes, and it's the classic question for historians, I'm a historian, is how those two stories happen, or how those projects move forward simultaneously, right? And I guess that collaboration that you're describing becomes essential, right? So that both can move forward at once, so that you can work in tandem, if that makes sense. So that it doesn't become a narrative to the side, right? But rather becomes integral to the work that you do, which it sounds like is precisely the direction you're heading in.
Yeah, our CEO, CJ Roberts, you know, I've heard him say repeatedly, you know, the Jackson House is the most exciting and the most important project that we have.
Yeah.
And, yeah, one thing, and this is related to kind of getting outside of our walls. For those that haven't been to the Tampa Bay History Center, it's a beautiful facility, especially for a medium-sized city. It's a great museum. And these walls have been a blessing, but they've also been a curse, in that this place is so nice, you know, for the city of Tampa, that sometimes we get confined and we get too focused on what we're doing here. So I think the Jackson House is an important part of reaching out, even though it's just, you know, it's literally just several blocks away. But we can tell different stories there, and stories, as you pointed out, that we've just, you know, we've neglected to this point.
Yeah.
And then the History Center has another initiative at another property that's about 60 miles north of here, and there's stories there that, you know, we don't tell here in this gallery. So yeah, I think we need to think of these not as peripheral projects, but things that are literally essential to what we're trying to do here.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like an incredibly exciting moment, and collecting individual and community stories is, you know, of course, central to that work. So congratulations on that.
Well, thank you. So far, so good. And, you know, we can never have enough stuff, that's for sure.
Right, right. So shifting gears just a little, but not entirely. And this is also, I think, one you were not expecting. Is there anything in particular, any sense of responsibility in particular, that you feel, or programming that you're doing in anticipation of the election around the corner?
The short answer to that is no. We're not. We're not doing any.
World. Yeah.
I'm sorry?
Or in an ideal world.
Yeah. Yeah, we don't have any election things coming up. It's partially due to, you know, our partial access, and obviously we've had few people attending, but no, I haven't been asked to make an election video for our museum and home series. And oh, one thing we did do, though, let me backtrack just a second. We have this Florida Conversation series, and one of my colleagues interviewed Pam Iorio for that. And she's really interesting in Tampa history because she was a mayor, and then she was also the supervisor of elections. And she's also an historian. She has a master's degree in history, and she wrote a great history on the white municipal party here in Tampa. So we did have her come, and well, I shouldn't say she came here. We did a virtual thing with her. To talk about the election. So we did do that, but that's the only thing election geared that we've had on the docket for the last few months.
And you also said that you work with the school system, is that right? That you work?
Yeah, so we have a great education department. We have great staff over there. And one thing they're always really involved in is teacher training. Okay. And so we did a virtual Zoom talk. I did a Zoom talk for the Pinellas County teachers and the Hillsborough County teachers. And just for people that don't know, you know, Hillsborough and Pinellas County are the two largest counties in terms of population here in the area. So
right.
That's one thing we like to do, is reach out to the teachers, you know, let them know that we're here for them. Oh, and one thing we did during the COVID closing is the education department worked on a lot of lesson plans and things like that teachers could use. So that's a big part of our mission.
I mean, there's a lot of power in that, of course, and the multiplying effect, right? When
Absolutely.
It's great work. So can you tell us a bit about how the Tampa Bay History Center interacts with other institutions, maybe outside of your area, besides the ones that you've mentioned that you partner with directly? In other words, are there professional networks with whom you work in Florida or nationwide? And has your experience been that museums and cultural institutions kind of across the state or across the nation or world, whatever your networks are similarly responding to the kind of anti-Black violence and to kind of creating kind of anti-racist programming and so forth? What's your experience of the kind of broader world of cultural institutions?
Yeah, I think we've been good with local institutions. I don't think we've done very well reaching out in a broad way. But locally, for example, USF just recently applied for a mini grant with the state Florida Humanities Council to work on both a program that's going to be a traditional talk on African American history here in Tampa, but they're also going to use it as a collection initiative, you know, to reach out to the community and be like, we're interested in your stories. We need to collect these things for posterity. And they asked us to be part of that. So we're going to be hosting and sponsoring a portion of that. So, you know, locally, we've done those things. Sort of more broadly, you know, as I mentioned earlier with the Cuban Pathways exhibit, I've been reaching out, but that's been more exhibit focused than focused on the Black Lives Matter movement and anti-racist politics of today. So I think for us, we've done okay locally, but we haven't really branched out and reached out to national organizations.
Well, I can say in terms of collaboration, we would love to collaborate with you here in Miami.
Great.
Many of our projects have to do with collecting of stories of communities and in neighborhoods and so forth. And one of which we have imagined in the future is to work with kind of partners throughout the state of Florida. So that's an exciting possibility moving forward. So maybe I will ask a final question and then we can open it up to questions that have come in. Do you think that your work has transformed for the duration? In other words, do you think these dual pandemics of anti-Blackness and COVID have kind of changed your work forever? Or is this simply just a moment in time?
I hope they have. And I think they will. I think, as I said, getting outside of the walls is important. So the museum from home stuff, the going out into the community and collecting, especially when it comes to the protest. And, you know, we've gone to different protests. We've gone to some protests in Pinellas County. We've gone to protest here. I think that needs to continue back to, I think your really important point and your best question, which is, you know, are you being proactive? Are you being reactive? Are you being unactive? I think this has forced us to be a little bit more proactive, right? Let's go out in the community. Let's not just sit back, you know, and wait for somebody on the board to call us and say, oh, I got this cool little thing, and we take it. You know, let's create a collections initiative. Let's admit the blind spots in the collection, and let's collect. I mean, let's do our job and communicate to people in the community that their experiences are essential, right? They're the things that create this human community that we have here in the Bay Area. So all that, I guess, is a poetic way to say, yes, I hope that going forward this has changed. We're going to do more of a reach out, you know, digitally and virtually, and also a reach out where we literally put, you know, our boots on the streets and we go out and we talk to people and we collect items.
It's great. I mean, all of that work out and talking to members of your community really in many ways acknowledges the power of the institution, right? I mean, one of the points of reckoning, I think, from all the cultural institutions and leaders with whom we've spoken since we began this series is really understanding what it means to be a director or a leader or in charge of public history at a beautiful institution inside the four walls, and how even that can be an intimidating experience for people to walk in and what that means, right? And this is a moment where each of us, I think, is reckoning with that power. And like you said, moving outside is partly accepting responsibility, it strikes me. So I think that's really, really terrific. I'll get off my soapbox and I will turn I will turn to the questions that we have. The first of which is from our very own Deputy Director. I think you probably know him or you've been in communication with him, Julio Capo Jr. He says, thanks so much for this conversation, Brad. Also great, and congrats on the forthcoming book.
Oh, thank you.
I was hoping to learn more about how you all at the Tampa Bay History Center decide the topics of your exhibitions, and if you have any examples of how they've been responsive to the needs of the community. And then he has a second question. So we'll start with that one and then we'll move on to the next.
Yeah, to be perfectly honest, the topics range from what we think is important historically to what will bring people in the gates. So for example, let me start with something that'll bring people in the gates. So in our temporary space, we currently have a exhibit called Sunshine State Showdown, Professional Wrestling in Tampa Bay. That was purposely designed to coincide with WrestleMania, right? Which was literally going to be right across the street from our facility and get people in there. So kind of just, shamelessly commercial. However, I will say this in our defense, as we sat back and we developed the exhibit, we said, well, how can we tell stories that have been left out? And there were two things we really focused on in the exhibit. We said, when people think about professional wrestling, women and African-American wrestlers were incredibly important, but they get left out of the story a lot. So we said we need to make sure that they become part of the story. So if you come to our exhibit, we talk a lot about the history of women's wrestling. We have women's wrestlers that are profiled and also the hardships they faced. In some markets, they wouldn't allow women to wrestle. So some of the major markets, women, their income is cut because they can't enter those markets. And then wrestling was incredibly exploitive. And then we write about African-American wrestlers, people like Bearcat, who was a Florida title holder, Rocky Johnson, who died recently and lived here in Tampa. We tell his story. So, that was one way that we chose an exhibit, right, for commercial reasons. And then let's tell stories that we think have been left out. And then in other ways, so for example, Cuban pathways, obviously Tampa has always had a large Cuban community. You're talking about my recent research when I was researching the Hispanic community. I think in the last 2 decades, I read about 20,000 Cubans have immigrated to Hillsborough County. And as I said, I think for a lot of people, they kind of think about Cuban immigration as happening during that cigar making moment. So with that exhibit, it was like, well, what's an important story we can tell? What do we have in our collection that we can tell that story? And then, as you said, what partner institutions can we reach out to help round out a exhibit that we can be proud of and that can travel around and that tells a story that hasn't really been told? There's been great exhibits like at History Miami on, Pedro Pan and other aspects of the movement of Cuban peoples or people to and from Cuba, but there hasn't really been an exhibit that covers that long, 500-year history. So for that one, I guess to put it poetically is kind of like a more pure, what's an important subject, what do we want to tell? So yeah, it goes both ways. I mean, we don't pretend the market doesn't exist, right? We have to have visitors, we have to have exhibits that attract them. But then we have to balance that with telling historical stories that we think have been neglected and that are incredibly important. And at times that are gonna, make people mad. There are people in our organization that weren't excited about us going out to the Black Lives Matter protest and collecting. But, we think it's as important as an institution, We're sorry it doesn't jive with, their feelings, but, this is a historical moment and we're gonna collect. So sorry for the long answer again, but yeah, so there's a lot of balls that, we have to juggle to make sure that we provide the historic content that we want.
It's a great answer. I think I'm echoing, and inevitably you're going to make members of your constituency less than happy. If you're not, then in a way you're not doing your job, right? I would argue.
If your collections committee doesn't get mad at you occasionally, then you're probably not collecting enough stuff. So that's the way I see it.
Exactly. So I'm going to take the liberty of asking Julio's second question because it was mine, although you began to answer it. But he writes, if time for another question, if you can tell us a little bit more about the Cuban migration exhibition. He says, I'm on the advisory board.
Yes, he is. He kindly volunteered.
Yeah, I think it would be of great interest to many folks here in South Florida, which generally represents another generation of Cuban diaspora, of course, instead of Tampa. And Ybor, I don't know how you pronounce that. So
yeah, that's great.
Yeah. So yeah, if you could just say a little bit, tell us, I also was curious about that, a little bit more about that exhibition, and then we'll have to wrap up.
Yeah, so the way that came about is as you said, when you think about, of course, Cuban migration to South Florida, particularly Miami-Dade County, you think about the post-revolutionary moment, right, 1959 and on. In Tampa, you think about really 1880 to about 1929, or if you're going to stretch it out, 1880 to the Cuban embargo, 1962, which really undercuts the Tampa cigar making industry. And so at first we were like, well, do we tell a story about that? And because that's what we have in the collection. And then we said, well, that's not really enough, at least in my opinion. And I said, well, one of the interesting things about Cuba is in a lot of ways it's been a portal, to the Western Hemisphere. It's been a place that a lot of people have transitioned through. And so one thing that gets lost is, I think in a lot of exhibits, we're just picking a particular thing, right? Post-revolutionary moment, Pedro Pan, cigar making movement. I think we need to tell maybe a fuller story of Cuba migration. And then, as you were saying, we sat back and we said, well, what are some of the things that haven't been told? And, one thing I'm particularly interested in is the movement of Chinese people to and from Cuba. So that's going to be a focus of the exhibit. And then, of course, this is about, histories of anti-Blackness. There's been obviously good work about slavery in Cuba and the movement of enslaved people to and from, particularly West Africans, but we thought, well, that's really important. That needs to be in the exhibit. So we need to talk about this movement of enslaved people. And so the idea was, well, then how do we bring all this together? And then that's how we came up with the idea of Cuban pathways, right? Not just to tell a particular story, a particular path, whether it be, Balseros, people that came over, after the fall of the Soviet Union, not just enslaved people in the 1600s, but let's tell this full human story. So we're really excited about the exhibit. It was supposed to debut January. That got pushed back because our friends at the Smithsonian and some of our other institutions said, well, we just can't get you stuff, right? It's not going to happen. And then, of course, we didn't want to, this is going to be a signature exhibit for us, and we want to travel it, and we're really invested in it. And we said, well, do we really want to release an exhibit or debut an exhibit if no one's going to be able to attend?
Right.
So in answer to Julio's questions, we pushed it back a little bit, and the plan now is to debut it in early 2022. So about a year and a few months, we'll have it out.
That's great. I mean, all pushing back is forgiven at this point. Right? Almost expected. Thank you so much, Brad. We're out of time, unfortunately, but thank you for such a lively and informative conversation. I really enjoyed it, and I look forward to future collaborations.
Well, thank you very much, and it was a pleasure to be here.
That was really great, and thank you to the audience. So join us next week, Thursday at 10, when my colleague, WPHL Deputy Director Julio Capo Jr. chats with Patricia Zeller, Executive Director, Fort Lauderdale Historical Society. So we look forward to that next week, and thank you again, Brad.
Thank you.
Take care. By time